Hello everybody, Steve Pusick with the SharePoint Embedded team. Today I want to show you how to set up your environment in Azure. Take advantage of the SharePoint Embedded containers that you're going to use in your application to store your documents. To get started, we are going to first create an app registration. This app registration will allow us to apply the appropriate graph permissions, the security with a certificate, client secret, everything that we're going to need to configure your application to interact with the containers and the documents that are in that environment. The next thing we're going to do is we have to create that container type. There are some PowerShell commands that we are going to use to create the container type and associate that to your Azure subscription for the billing that needs to happen for the storage, API calls, and any egress charges that you are going to incur. Once we have that, we're going to create a new container. Containers are where documents are stored in your application. And then from there, you'll have everything you need to develop that application in your custom application. You can do some testing in Postman or Bruno, whatever your line of business app is as well. All of the scripts that I'm going to be using are going to be available on GitHub and fully ready for you to download those and include those into your environment. Okay, so the first step is we are going to go into the Azure portal and I'm going to create a new app registration. It says we navigate to Entra and go to app registrations. I'm going to create a new app registration. I'm going to call this video demo and I'm going to register that app registration. Now that we have the app registration created, we have that client ID and tenant that we're going to use in our script. But before we get there, what I want to do is I want to focus specifically on all of the components that we need in the app registration to make things work. If we go to the authentication portion, if you are using Postman or Bruno or an application that you need to authenticate with, make sure that you do put that redirect URI in the authentication portion. We need to create ourselves a new secret and upload a certificate. I'm going to create a new client secret here. Expire according to your company policy. Once we create that, that value is going to appear once and only once. As soon as we navigate away from the screen, that value is not going to be available. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to paste that into my PowerShell script or my Visual Studio Code window so we have things for safekeeping. And as we start to create our information and our container, that is where we're going to store all of our variables that we're going to use in the scripts that are going to precede us. So now that we have that app registration and the client secret that's been created, now we need to upload that certificate. So if you do have a certificate, great. If you don't have a certificate, then I do have a script that will create that for you. So here we need to specify the container name as the variable. And if I were to execute that, I'm going to set my variables. Everything is set there. All I need to do is run that create cert script, and that is going to create that certificate name. So here I'm just going to call this SPE video demo. And now we have the appropriate certificate that's been created in that directory. If I navigate back to my app registration, simply selecting that file. Here's my SPE video demo cert that we just created. Open that, add that, and then I'm going to copy that thumbprint. Paste that thumbprint back into Visual Studio Code so that we can use that as we're creating our container type. All is well. So now we've got everything I need for our certificates and secrets. If I go to my API registration, this is where we need to create the permissions, the graph permissions for our app registration. So if we add permissions, I'm going to add delegated permissions for file storage container.selected. File storage container.selected. And I'm also going to do the same thing for application level permissions as well. Again, a decision point that you're going to need to make when you're creating your application on what type of permissions do you want. Normally, we do recommend delegated permissions so that you have user context within your application and audit log and so forth. Okay, so we have both of our file storage container selected permissions, both delegated and application. This is where we're going to need to grant admin consent for that graph permissions. And all is well there. In order for us to register the container type within SharePoint, this is where we need to use the SharePoint graph permissions versus SharePoint Embedded or the file storage container graph permissions. This is a temporary thing. We are working on a graph endpoint to make that happen. But for now, what we need to do is we need to manually add that into the manifest so that we can grant admin permissions there. What I've done is simply copy this entire string that's in the download available on GitHub, and I'll put a reference to that here shortly. But if we navigate down to where that is in our app manifest, simply highlight all of that, paste it, save it, all is well. And you'll know everything is saved properly because it was updated accordingly. Okay, that is what we need to configure the app registration. Now that we have that added to the app manifest, you'll notice that we also need to grant admin permissions for the SharePoint permissions that we just manually added. To do that, we're going to go over to the enterprise applications, and this will allow us to grant admin access to those SharePoint permissions. Once this comes up, then we'll be able to grant that permission. We'll have the ability to accept those permissions, and then that will be used within our app manifest. We're going to be presented with the user that we want to authenticate with and the permissions that are granted by that permission in the app manifest. As soon as we accept that, we can then navigate back to our app registration, and we should have grant admin permissions for everyone in the tenant. I'm going to go back and copy the client ID because we're going to need that in our script. Within our script, I'm going to paste in that app ID or client ID. They're both synonymous. The client secret we already have. The tenant ID. If you need that tenant ID, you can always obtain that from your app registration as well. I'm going to give it the container name of SPE video demo, and the container type and the container name are going to be similar. We're also going to need that Azure subscription ID. So if you have an Azure subscription ID, great. If you don't, that is something that's going to be required once we associate the billing to the container type that we're going to create here shortly. You're also going to need a resource group. So if you have the permission to create those, go ahead and create those now. If you don't, then you want to create those before you register the application. The path to our key. So the key that we just created is this SP demo. No, actually it's here. So this is where, yeah, so we do have an SP demo key that was created. So if we wanted to use that, here's my SPE video demo certificate. This is where I'm going to put that in as my variable to be used as well. So not only did it create the certificate, but it also created the key that we need that's associated to that thumbprint, and then the admin user, and we'll get to that here in a second. Now that we have all of our variables set, I'm going to go ahead and run that, and all of the variables will now be set in PowerShell. Great. All right. Again, we don't need to run that certificate because we've already created one. Next thing we do need to do is import the SharePoint Online PowerShell modules. If we do the app registration and the container type registration, they are dependent on those PowerShell commands. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to log in to the SharePoint Admin Center so that we can register that container type. Now it's going to ask me for my authentication. This is where I do need to be a SharePoint admin or SharePoint Embedded Administrator role that you can assign in Entra. So as I assign that, great. Now we are logged in as the SharePoint Administrator. This is where I'm going to create my new container type. So the container name and the app ID, that Azure app ID that we just created, is going to be used. And yes, we're going to do everything here. Now what's going to happen is the container type ID is going to be created. We're going to copy that because we need that in our next step. So I'm going to go ahead and populate that variable. And I'm going to reset that variable so that we have it. Okay, so all my variables have been reset. I've also got it down here if you want to reset it down there, all as well. But now that we have that container type created, this is where we're also going to associate the billing to that container type. So now that we have that container type ID and the Azure subscription, the resource group, and the region that we want to associate that to, we can run that and associate the billing. There is a delay on when the container type is created. So if you do get an error, be patient, try again in a couple minutes. But in this case, we're in good shape. We can see that this has been created, and the classification that we're looking for is that standard container type that has been created. All right. So now that we have the container type created, we've got the billing associated to that container type. We need to register this with SharePoint. So this is where it needs that SharePoint-based token to register the container type with the tenant and the thumbprint for the certificate that we have created. I've got all that wrapped up into this SPE registration script. So all you need to do is pass in the parameters that you see here and then simply run the script. Once we run the script with the parameters, it's going to go ahead and create that SharePoint token that we need against the certificate that we uploaded into the app registration. It'll create that necessary permission object so that we can register that container type with the application. Once we have that done, then you'll get a confirmation message that everything has been created. At that point, we are going to create our first container. And in this case, I'm going to take the client secret and the display name of container 1. That'll be the name that we see in the SharePoint Admin Center. It will again generate the appropriate client secret or certificate-based token that we need to authenticate into SharePoint and create that container. So as I run this, then you'll see it's also going to assign the owner to that person that we have designated in our admin user. And you'll notice that we're going to get the container ID. The container ID is going to look like this. So we know that that has been successfully registered within SharePoint. And if we go back to the SharePoint Admin Center, then we should be able to see that in our active containers. Now this does take a little bit of time to register with the SharePoint Admin Center. So I'm going to refresh the screen here and we'll give that a second to appear within the SharePoint Admin Center with the container name that we created. And you can see that my SPE video demo has been registered with the SharePoint Admin Center with the container name that we provided in the script. So now that everything has been created, if we go into that container, you'll also see that the membership is that person, the admin user that we specified in our registration script when we created that container. Recapping what we need to do to configure a container,